Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Initiative for Global Security of the Dickey Center and the Department of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's event. My name is Peter DeShazo. I'm a visiting professor of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies. Our guest today, before starting, I'd like to thank the staffs of the Dickey Center very much and the staffs of Lilacs for all the hard work they put in to making this event possible. Our guest today is Ambassador Adam Namm, who is the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission, the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission of the Organization of American States, which is the entity within the OAS that assists the member states in addressing the drug problem in their countries and in the Western Hemisphere. Ambassador Namm had a very distinguished career at the U.S. State Department. He was a career diplomat, was assigned to U.S. embassies, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and occupied a number of very senior positions at the State Department. He was nominated by President Obama to be the U.S. ambassador to Ecuador, where he served for 3 years. Ambassador Namm is a graduate of Brown University and has a master's degree in international affairs from the National War College. Upon retiring from the Foreign Service, he took his position that he currently has at the OAS in 2016. He's been in that position ever since. Adam, welcome. It's great to have you. It's great to have you here. The drug problem is something that just never seems to go away. It's a problem that has been taken different manifestations. It's incredibly vexing, very difficult, multifaceted. Right now, we're experiencing a huge spike in deaths caused by synthetic opioids. The Coca and cocaine production coming out of the Andean region in Latin America is perhaps the highest that it's ever been. The drug problem manifests itself in so many different ways beyond public health, which we're so well aware of. The fact that it fuels organized crime in Latin America, we've seen that manifestation in different countries, Ecuador recently, in particular fashion. So it's a problem that is, again, one that is so multifaceted, so difficult that it's really hard to, it's sort of hard to come to terms with at a given setting. But I can think of no one better than Ambassador Namm to have a global view of this challenge and to discuss it with us. We'll have a brief conversation, a few questions, and then we'll open up the discussion to the audience for questions and answers. Ambassador, what's your view of the sort of scope and nature of the drug problem? It's so broad, but again, from your vantage point, how do you see the really key challenges, the key variables in the drug problem in the Americas today?
Well, thank you, Ambassador DeShazo. Peter, pleasure to be here. I will say it's my first time at Dartmouth, and you heard from Ambassador DeShazo, I'm a Brown graduate. Don't hold that against me. But this is the 8th and last Ivy League campus that I have visited. In other words, I've been to all the others. So Dartmouth is a beautiful place driving in today. And thank you for the invitation to be here. The drug problem is, as Ambassador DeShazo said, multifaceted. It is ever-changing. And I'll start off with a few key themes. One is the drug problem is, in the Western Hemisphere, is no longer a question of the South producing and the North consuming, right? The old model was that the cocaine and other drugs came up from South America, came up through Central America, and were all consumed in the US and Canada. While it's true that the US and Canada have terrible consumption problems, the South, Latin America, Caribbean, are also consumer countries. Every country in the hemisphere and every country in the world has a drug problem. The drugs are different depending on the country. In North America, everybody knows about the terrible opioid problem that kills, by varying estimates, anywhere from 70 to 100,000 people a year in the US, another 20,000 or so in Canada. In South America, it's not so much opioids, but in the Southern Cone, down in Argentina and Chile, there's a terrible problem with smokable cocaine. There's a major cocaine problem in Brazil, depending on the country that you go to. So this is a hemispheric problem. I'll tell you one of the things that changed the game in terms of consumption in Latin America is that some years ago, the drug traffickers changed their payment model. Used to be they would sell the illicit drugs for cash on the streets in North America and Europe, what have you, and get the cash back to South America to pay off the producers and pay off the traffickers. And starting probably 10 or 15 years ago, drug traffickers realized, there's a better way to do this, because getting cash back to pay people is fraught. It's risky because cash can be stolen, a small plane can go down, as one did in Ecuador with $3 or $4 million in cash. So they started paying off the producers, or more the mules and the corrupt port officials, in product. So if you're a corrupt official working in the port of Guayaquil, Ecuador, instead of getting $2,000 for your services, you get a brick of cocaine. Well, to make your money, to convert that into cash, which is what you want, you've got to sell the cocaine locally. And that has spiked the drug problem in South America and in Central America. Which brings me to my second point, which is there is an absolute relationship between drug supply and drug demand. They each drive each other. When I came into this job 7.5 years ago, I thought that, there's a supply because there's a demand, but there is also demand because there is supply. And maybe that was naive on my part 7.5 years ago, but the drug cartels, pushers on the street, do a pretty good job at getting people hooked. In many cases, drugs are now adulterated, more and more adulterants in drugs, which is point number 3. I have a 9-year-old at home, and I tell him, if you try drugs, you don't know what you're taking. 30 years ago, you'd be more or less sure that the drug you were going to take, if you chose to take a drug, whether it was marijuana or cocaine or heroin, was going to be pure, at least unadulterated. Now there are tons of adulterants in drugs. At concerts, raves, this kind of thing, some places will test pills to see what's in them. There was an incident of one drug gang in Buenos Aires a couple years ago poisoning the cocaine supply of another drug gang with carfentanil, which is even more powerful than fentanyl, killed about 25 people very quickly. So adulterants are a major danger. So Peter said, the name of my shop is the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission, and I put emphasis on the word control. You're never going to get rid of it, and I realized that pretty early on in this job. Unfortunately, like violence and crime, the drugs are an ill of humanity, or at least the abuse of drugs, both illicit and licit, that has been going on probably since human beings roamed the earth and started to pick leaves that got them high, and it's just part of the human condition. So it's a question of control, and we do that in CICAD. CICAD is the Spanish language acronym for the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission, and we do that through demand programs, treatment and prevention, some supply reduction programs, things like drug treatment courts, and I can go on about all those, but I'll stop there with that opening answer.
Well, thank you very much. I was going to ask if you could give a little bit more detail about what CICAD does, and what you've seen over the years that appears to work, and perhaps what doesn't work.
Thank you. We've been around CICAD since 1986. We were created by the OAS member states, which are the owners of the organization, if you will. There are 35 member states, or 35 states in the Western Hemisphere. Actually, I should have asked for hands to see if anybody could guess, but from Canada down to Argentina and Chile, there are 35 sovereign states in the Americas. 3 states are not participating in the OAS, 3 countries. One is Nicaragua, which formally withdrew from the Organization of American States, unfortunately withdrew last year. Cuba, which has not participated for a long time. They were suspended. Their membership was suspended in the early 60s, and it was reinstated in the early 90s, but has chosen not to participate. And then Venezuela, where the OAS member states do not recognize the dictatorship in Venezuela, and that is a question at some point to be resolved. Did recognize the Juan Guaido government while that existed. So 32 member states, they created the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission in 1986 to respond to the then cocaine problem, crack cocaine problem. We are part of what's called the Secretariat for Multidimensional Security, which always to me sounds like a picture of Rubik's Cube, turning a Rubik's Cube, multidimensional security. But there are 3 other departments besides CICAD in the Secretariat for Multidimensional Security. One is anti-terrorism. Another is the Department of Public Security, which does a variety of things, migration issues, demining, prisons. And then there's a Department Against Transnational Organized Crime, which looks at human trafficking, arms trafficking, money laundering. And we all work together, and there's a lot of overlap. But CICAD, I have 5 units in the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission Executive Secretariat. One is demand reduction, which, as I mentioned earlier, does training of trainers mainly on prevention, treatment, and now we're getting into rehabilitation. So training of trainers who can then train others in those skills. A supply reduction unit, which operates 2 schools that do counterdrug intelligence training, one for the Spanish, and also the Brazilians come, Portuguese speaking, which is in Bogota, Colombia, operated jointly with the Colombian National Police, who, as you would guess, have quite a bit of expertise and experience in that area. And then another one in Trinidad and Tobago in Port of Spain for the countries of the English-speaking Caribbean. Then I have an institutional strengthening unit, which does alternatives to incarceration, alternative development, helping countries set up and strengthen drug policies and strategies. And then the other 2 units are the Inter-American Observatory on Drugs, which collects statistics on drug use, drug supply, helps national observatories. Just about every country has an observatory, again, to collect data. You can't treat a problem unless you know how big the problem is. And then the last unit is something called the multilateral evaluation mechanism, which is a peer review process, which experts are provided by each country, and they write reports on how other countries in the hemisphere are doing on their drug policies and the implementation of those policies. But to your question, Ambassador, what's effective? One of our marquee programs in our institutional strengthening unit is alternatives to incarceration. Drug treatment courts being the most recognized alternative to incarceration. If you go back 12 years, well, let me go back further than that. Drug treatment courts started in Miami in 1989, and this was in the middle, about the same time that CICAD was created. 1989, and the district attorney of Dade County, Florida in 1989 was a woman named Janet Reno. You recognize that name. She became Attorney General of the United States under President Clinton. And Janet Reno was the Attorney General of Dade County, Florida, Miami. And the police were arresting lots of folks for selling and for using, smoking cocaine. And she got together with a judge, and they said, what are we going to do? We're going to fill the prisons several times over. We have to come up with some alternative to incarceration. And they came up with this idea of a drug treatment court, where you are still convicted of an offense, and there's debate about whether drug use should be criminal or not. I know that's out there, but the reality is, in most places, especially hard drugs, you're certainly selling, but also possessing, you'll be convicted if found. But rather than being sentenced to prison, let's sentence these folks, and this is for minor offenses. These are not murderers. This is someone that steals an iPhone, steals a bicycle while on drugs, or simple possession. Sentence them to a drug treatment program. And that's how drug treatment courts were born. They started in Miami. Does anybody want to take a guess as to how many drug treatment courts there are now in the United States? 4,000, about 4,000, just about every jurisdiction. I guarantee you there's one here in the county or in the city. They're in Canada, and 12 years ago they were in the US, Canada, Chile was an early adopter, Mexico, and Jamaica, those 5 countries, if you go back a dozen years. Now, 14 countries of the Americas have drug treatment courts, and we have been instrumental, CICAD, my institutional strengthening unit, in helping to set up those courts, talking to governments, providing information. Horizontal cooperation is key. In other words, better than me going in and explaining to Peru, which recently set up drug treatment courts, how they work, better to have Colombians or Mexicans who speak the same language, have the same legal system, help a country like Peru set up drug treatment courts. So we rely heavily in the OAS in general on horizontal technical cooperation. But these drug treatment courts, in addition to providing a more humane, if you will, way to treat minor drug offenders, also help reduce prison overcrowding, which is a major problem throughout the Americas. And they have been successful. They are not inexpensive. They require resources. They require a re-education, if you will, of judges and prosecutors, the whole team. And I've attended a few of these courts. In fact, Will in Maryland in a couple of weeks, attend another one. But there's usually a meeting before the court with the judge and the prosecutor and defense and the social worker and maybe the police. How is so-and-so doing in this program? It's usually a 6-month program, or maybe it's a year. And so the folks going through that program are very carefully monitored. But many, not all, but many come out and they've gone through the treatment program and they are not going to reoffend, and that is a real accomplishment, I think. And for me, it's a marquee program of CCAD.
The sort of macro approaches to crime organized crime and drugs in the region sort of spans the gamut from mano dura in some countries to a very different approach of negotiating with even criminal gangs to try to achieve lower levels of violence in the region. How do you see this sort of give and take dynamic playing out?
Yeah, organized crime is a terrible force, and it is the driving force behind not only drug trafficking, but also, I mentioned we have in the OAS and the Secretariat for Multidimensional Security, a department against transnational organized crime, human trafficking, arms trafficking, money laundering, and it's the same criminal organizations that are involved in all of these things at the same time. And I'll throw in one more, which is something that the Department Against Transnational Organized Crime looks at, which is illegal mining in places like Colombia and Ecuador and Peru, where there is illegal gold and mining of other metals that goes on. And there is absolutely a nexus between the gangs that protect or are involved in illegal cultivation and drug trafficking and illegal mining, as well as the other crimes I mentioned. And corruption also, which underlies all of this and affects countries throughout the region, is a major problem and has to be tackled. The way that you start to address organized crime are with policies that recognize the problem, and then there are ways, and whether it's going after financial assets, whether it's eradication of crops, whether it's counter-narcotics intelligence, which we train on, stopping drugs in the ports. It's not easy, and it's as I said, the drug problem, I would be naive if I said we hope to end the drug problem. It's not going to end. It's a question of control, but organized crime is really a scourge, and it's up to governments, and we try, and other entities in the OAS work with the member states of the OAS to address organized crime.
What about, you mentioned at the beginning the synthetic opioids and other synthetics. How do you see the scope of that and the evolution of that problem?
Yeah, synthetics. I'll give you a story, which is my Maria Hines, who is she's an American. She is the chief of my Inter-American Observatory on Drugs in CICAD, and she came into the office one day pretty devastated. I said, Maria, what happened? She said, my kids, high school kids in Arlington, knew 3 kids who took a few pills in the bathroom at Wakefield High School in Arlington, Virginia. They contained fentanyl. One of them died immediately. The other 2 went to the hospital. My nephew, who's out of college, but knows somebody, this is in Larchmont, New York, who dropped dead of, opioids and synthetic opioids, fentanyl, other opioids, other synthetic drugs are affecting many people in bad ways. Again, back to adulterants. I'll tell you another story. There was just an article yesterday, the day before, in the New York Times about Guatemalan poppy producers. Poppy, of course, used to make heroin. Poppy farmers in Guatemala going out of business because of synthetics. You saw it. And this has happened in Mexico also, and the law of unintended consequences. Let's go back. Fentanyl is mostly produced, the precursor chemicals that go into making fentanyl are produced in Asia, just about 100%. China is the biggest producer. India to a certain extent, Bangladesh to a lesser extent. And they make their way to the Americas on ships, and And Mexico is is the largest producer, certainly in this hemisphere, of fentanyl made from these precursor chemicals. And we have by the way, an experts group in CICAD. Countries get together, experts. It's a group on chemical substances and pharmaceutical products to look at precursor chemicals and look at the products that they go into. So fentanyl is made in Mexico. Now, how does it get here? It gets to the U.S. mainly via legal crossings. Very little, and you probably know this, very little fentanyl can kill you. If you take a packet of sugar like you'd get in a restaurant, one packet of sugar would contain how many fentanyl doses? Does anybody want to take a guess? About 500. One packet of sugar. So next time you're in a restaurant or Starbucks, you get a packet of sugar. If that were filled with fentanyl, it would contain 500 doses. So it doesn't take a lot. And in fact, we just signed an agreement with the Postal Union of Latin America, because a lot of this stuff, you don't need container ships or trucks. You can just put it in an envelope. Put a few packets of, sugar, quote unquote, in an envelope, and that's many doses of fentanyl. So it's being shipped through postal means, and it's coming across the border from Mexico in cars and trucks that are crossing in San Diego and crossing in El Paso, et cetera. So the precursor chemicals come, they're turned into fentanyl, they're used by folks that were previously heroin users because it's cheaper, it gives a better high. There was one story of a user waking up in the hospital, almost died, had gotten Narcan to save his life, and woke up, and the first thing he said is, "Where can I get another hit of that stuff? That was so great," which, to me, it doesn't make sense. If you just were almost killed by it, why would you want to do it again? But this is somebody who's drug dependent, who suffers from drug dependence. This is what goes on. It's very potent, and again, has put many poppy farmers in Mexico, Guatemala, out of business. And I will end with this answer with one very scary thing. Someone in the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, which you know well, they're the folks that look at the drugs issues as well as organized crime issues, et cetera, said to me, the drug traffickers now are starting to use artificial intelligence to manufacture drugs. And that in so many years, there will be no purely natural drugs, so that even any cocaine you take, any heroin that you shoot, will contain some degree of synthetics, because the drug traffickers are constantly looking for ways to give their drugs more pop, get people higher quicker, and that synthetics are going to make their way into everything and via artificial intelligence. Very scary, very sobering. I wonder if, I say, thinking out loud, I wonder if synthetics and the great risk where there is no quality control with our illegal drugs, that may eventually lessen the use of illicit drugs, because people will be scared off, not knowing, and I go back to that example of the 3 14-year-olds in the bathroom in the high school in Arlington, not knowing what they're getting, what they're taking.
I recall my first tour in the Foreign Service, and way back in 1977, at the beginning of the Carter administration, when I was assigned to Bolivia, and drugs was a topic that was gaining profile in terms of the bilateral relationship. And I went from there to be U.S. consul in Medellin, where I was right at the heart of the issue, and it was an issue that I worked on constantly for all these years, as did you. What, from your vantage point now, where you're not a U.S. government employee, what advice would you give in terms of how the United States can shape its counter-drug policies with regard internationally, not so much the domestic, but that's very important as well. How would you see a more effective policy going forward?
Well, first thing I'd say is continue to fund the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission in the OAS. And I think we are very good bang for the buck, if you will. My budget in CICAD, in the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission, it's about $7 to $10 million a year. It's not a ton of money compared to other things. But with the technical assistance we provide countries, the evaluative, I talked about the Inter-American Observatory, we publish reports, we publish information bulletins. We have something called an early warning system of the Americas, and countries have national early warning systems where the hospitals provide information to the police on what overdose, not names, and they're not violating privacy, but what are the drugs that you're seeing coming into the emergency room. In the US, these are very mature kinds of systems, not so much in a small Caribbean country or a Central American country. In fact, I'm going to go to St. Lucia in beginning of June, in a month, because they're going to inaugurate an early warning system, which we have helped to set up with U.S. funding, back to the question. Mm-hmm. The U.S. is about 70% of our funding. Canada is also an important funder. Canada, by the way, funds gender programs and other things, but an emphasis on gender programs. Canada has a feminist foreign policy. That's exactly the way they say it. And we've had a few programs, one, gender in law enforcement, where this is to sensitize countries in the Caribbean and Latin America to the value of female police officers, both at the street level, if you will, and in positions, higher positions. And I smile. I was telling Tom that I have a 28-year-old daughter who is a DC police officer. So I know the value of female police officers. And also funds a project that is looking at gender in the criminal justice system. How are women, how are members of the LGBTQ community treated in the justice system, again, for drug-related offenses? That's what we focus on. So, I don't want to speak for the U.S., but I think certainly CICAD, having been a U.S. diplomat, but not where I am now. And but the U.S., the U.S. is very involved throughout the world, funding, in addition to the OAS, funding the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which is based in Vienna, Austria, which does a lot of work around the world. Some other organizations funding governments directly, funding non-governmental organizations to do the work. So the U.S. and other countries are certainly out there working this problem. And I will, on the U.S., talk about now a major, if I can, shift in U.S. policy. When I first came to CICAD 7.5 years ago, the U.S. did not use the term harm reduction, right? You all know what harm reduction is. And needle exchange is sort of the oldest example of harm reduction. But now it's also machines that test drugs at concerts that I talked about a while ago. What are you taking? Do you know is that pill that's you're about to pop going to kill you? And it really has been synthetic drugs, opioids, that have changed the game in the United States and other countries. And 2 years ago, President Biden used the term harm reduction in his State of the Union address. And I sort of knew it was coming, but my jaw dropped nonetheless, because I was 7 years ago, I didn't use the words harm and reduction in the same sentence necessarily, at CICAD, because there were countries, including the U.S., that were absolutely opposed to it. That has changed. And I think understandably, and it's a positive change. with 100,000 people in the U.S., 70 or so thousand of those died from opioids, the other 30,000 or so from other drug overdoses. With that many deaths, you have to look at harm reduction. You have to. And so the U.S. is doing that now. And I will say that harm reduction is also making its way into official language that the OAS uses. That is a sea change.
Great, thank you. Why don't we open up to questions? If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll give you a microphone. Please speak clearly into the microphone and frame your question. Ma'am? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming here today. I have two questions related to treatment. Number one is, have you heard about Ibogaine?
Have I heard about?
Ibogaine.
Ibogaine, I have not.
It's a substance derived from a bush that is in West Africa, and it is polydrug effective. It's one of the only things that can help people get off of methamphetamines. It works for opioids. It works for cocaine. It is currently Schedule 1, even though it has been shown, there was just a recent study in Brazil, for example, with 2,500 people that showed abstinence of 72% after a couple of years. U.S. has decided to make that Schedule 1. I would love to see that change. I think we could save so many lives if we could study that. And here in New Hampshire at Dartmouth, we're in a special place. We have a pharmacy board that can set its own scheduling parameters for drugs, and we have a world-class research hospital right in our back door here. There's so much we could do here to test it. One of the reasons it's not as popular is there are some risks, but there are protocols being developed that reduce the danger of it. People have to be screened for cardiac problems. That would be a contraindication for taking this. But it's something that would be great if we could save people's lives with it.
Thank you.
And I have some handouts here about that. I was asked not to hand them out at this event, but
Great. Thank you very much.
outside afterwards.
Thank you. Question here?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I'm
Yes.
sorry. Well, you go ahead and then here.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I am better? Okay. I am a Mexican-American student, and I am hoping to start a thesis project next year, which Professor DeShazo will advise, on the dynamics between firearm trafficking, organized crime in Mexico, and drug trafficking at large. And just going back to Professor DeShazo's question about like space for U.S. policy, and really like the role that the U.S. plays in maybe incentivizing some of this trafficking, either of firearms or of drugs. I think I have a two-part question. So do you view the U.S. as having some sort of role in incentivizing these things? And my background for this is, for example, firearm trafficking, like firearms in Mexico are largely trafficked from the U.S. Mexico has one firearm store, and about 80 to 90% of the firearms that are used in organized violence come from the U.S. So I think there is an inherent U.S. role in that. And another one would be like NAFTA or neoliberal policies, which have, in some ways or others, also incentivized drug trafficking. Do you view any of these spots as a possible avenue towards U.S. policy to curbing some of these like bigger organized crime and trafficking dynamics?
Thank you for the question. Firearms trafficking comes up all the time. We have two what are called regular sessions meetings of the Commission, the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission, every year. One that will actually be next Tuesday and one that's held in the fall. And the issue of firearms trafficking has come up, I want to say at least two or three or four of the last four regular sessions meetings. And there has been lots of discussion about arms trafficked from the U.S., also from Europe to a certain extent. Brazil, there are other countries that are manufacturers of firearms. I go back to organized crime, which I discussed earlier. There is no question that organized crime, drug traffickers, they're the same people that do human trafficking and other types of illicit activities, use firearms, which are often obtained illegally. The OAS has a commission that looks at firearms trafficking. I'm not going to get into U.S. policy. I'm not representing the U.S., but I can tell you as the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Drug Abuse Control Commission, it does come up. Countries, including Mexico, have stressed the importance of drug trafficking, the negative effect that has on the phenomenon of drug trafficking. So, it is there, it is discussed, and I think it's something that will continue to be discussed.
Thanks. Question here. Could we go here and then there, please? Thank you.
Hello, Ambassador. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Monique Cummings, and I'm a senior here at Dartmouth. I have 2 questions for you, even though I can think of 1,000. The first one being, how do you think the kind of attempt and dissolution of the ELN peace process in Colombia is going to impact those illegal gold mining sectors or continued drug trade in the region, because they certainly fill the vacuum that the FARC left behind? And my second question is, how do you think Bukele's strategy in El Salvador with the Mara is going to work in the long term?
On Colombia, Colombia is a major cocaine producer, no question about it. There's also no question that, again, transnational organized crime groups are heavily involved in cocaine production. I think groups that started off years ago as ideologically based groups have turned into criminal groups, plain and simple. Colombia recently came out with a new drug policy, which has more of a focus on the demand side, alternative development, which is another piece. I haven't talked about that. Both rural alternative development, crop substitution, but also urban alternative development. The person selling drugs on a street corner in a city, how do you give them opportunity? And it is actually we have 4 experts groups. I mentioned one earlier on chemical and pharmaceutical products. One is on alternative development. Peru chairs it, and not surprisingly, Colombia vice chairs it. I mean, those are the 2 big cocaine producing countries. So Colombia will pursue its new policy. The president is trying to achieve peace, and that is a noble goal. And Colombia, being a member of the Organization of American States, we do work with Colombia, and we'll continue to work with Colombia to help it implement its new policy. But it's a pernicious issue, and again, folks that had been ideologically based over the years, there's a lot of money in it, unfortunately, and these criminal gangs who are also into the other crimes I mentioned, and that has to be addressed. And then El Salvador. El Salvador is more of a drug transit country. It is not a drug-producing country in any great measure. And your question on the Bukele government's policy, if you can repeat that or amplify that for me.
Yes, just his pretty successful mano dura policy of rounding up everyone associated with the Mara and locking them in those prisons. And now it's sort of left everyone wondering, what next? Will he release them? will he execute them? Will he let them rot away forever?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that this is going to work in the long run?
Can't really comment on that. I mean, out of my zone, out of the drugs area, I know, yes, it has definitely been a mano dura approach. I also know, and I see the statistics, that crime has gone down significantly in El Salvador. What happens in the long run, I can't speak to. El Salvador, again, is a member state of the OAS and will continue to work with it. I will say, for example, they have a very strong early warning system. They were one of the first countries, I believe that predates the Bukele administration, but has been continued by the Bukele administration to strengthen the early warning system on drugs to share information. So again, we'll continue to, they participate actively in our meetings, in our experts groups, and we'll go forward. The larger questions, though, I'm not in a position to speak to, but thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you for being here today. My name's Yulia. I'm a government economics major here at Dartmouth. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how synthetic producers are implementing artificial intelligence in their process.
Ooh, well, this news was given to me only probably a month ago. As I said, there was somebody in the State Department that. So I can't give you chapter and verse on how it's being used. I can't give you chapter and verse as to how artificial intelligence functions because, but. I think artificial intelligence is one of the waves of the future or the present. It is here and it is affecting the way papers are written or whatever it is. So it doesn't shock me that artificial intelligence would play an increasing role in the production of drugs, and that's a scary thing. I mean, it is. And as I said. There is when you take an illicit drug, there is no quality control. I'll talk about marijuana also, which that's a question that comes up a lot. We don't take a position. I mean, we're the commission. I'm the executive secretary of a commission that is made up of the member states of the OAS, right? Member states ultimately decide, they're sovereign countries, they decide what they're going to do, whether they want to decriminalize marijuana or other drugs, or throw people in jail, whatever. That's there. And then there may be other issues, but there are other bodies at the OAS that might look at that. Marijuana, which is decriminalized in many states in the U.S. and in Canada, Uruguay in South America was one of the first places to decriminalize it. Canada. One of the unintended consequences there is that the THC level is way up. It's way up. My line is, it's not your father's or mother's or grandparents' marijuana. I mean, this is not the marijuana of the 1960s or 70s. This is a much more potent, whether it's legally procured or illegally procured, because the folks that grow marijuana are they're breeding it to increase the THC level, which, by the way, means the CBD level comes down. The supposedly good, there's debate on that, the good compound in marijuana. But they're breeding it so people get high, get quicker and stronger. In the U.S., I think I'm right, I think it was 500,000 people in 2022 that went to the hospital, didn't die, but went to the hospital for marijuana overdose, if you will, toxic reaction to marijuana. That's pretty high. Occasionally, very few deaths. Occasionally, and tragically, a young child will get into the parents' gummy supply and take a whole thing of gummies, and that can kill a kid. But so even marijuana, which is perceived by many not to be a dangerous drug, is putting a lot of people in the hospital. Not to mention adulterants. And so far, I mean, certainly in legal markets, you don't see so much adulteration, but yes, occasionally, and then in illegal markets, yes. I have not heard of marijuana adulterated with fentanyl, that, one puff and you drop. Whether that's coming, I don't know, but again, any illicit drug, you don't know ultimately what you're getting. There's no quality control, at least no government-provided quality control.
Do we have another question?
Hi. Yeah, my name is Rajuda. I'm a senior here at Dartmouth. My question was about something that I think we see in DC, and I know you're not coming from the US perspective, so I guess my question will be more general, is that the sort of federal laws against marijuana or the federal illegalization of marijuana, at least based on my conversations with people in DC, has been a big sort of detriment to the talent acquisition in the federal pool, because a lot of, especially presidential management fellows or young people will use marijuana legally in the states or in the localities and then are ineligible then for security clearances or et cetera on the federal level. And I was wondering how that patchwork element of, state, local rules not intersecting with national regulations can kind of impact how U.S. drug enforcement is seen on a larger scale or on an international scale, or if it does at all.
Yeah, again, I can't speak for the U.S. I'm not representing the U.S. I can, though, speak to the clearance question, having been a government employee with a clearance for many years. I knew people, and now this goes back to the 80s when I joined the Foreign Service, who had done drugs, mainly marijuana, I think some others. And I will say that as a general rule, the key on any security clearance questionnaire is to be honest. And so I know people who, back in the 80s when, marijuana wasn't legal anywhere, who were able to get top secret clearances because they had been honest. Just as a general rule, in the security clearance process, the worst thing to do is lie, because whether it's about drugs or anything else, because if you lie, then you set yourself up for one day being compromised by a foreign intelligence service. We know something that your employer doesn't know. So better to just come clean about everything. So but I can't speak to the current state of play. All I know is I know people who came into the Foreign Service in the 80s who would smoke pot and done other drugs. In terms of U.S. policy and in terms of back to clearances, or was something else?
No, just more generally, kind of the fact that the U.S. can't seem to align itself on how it's approaching drugs, across the board. How does that sort of project internationally?
There is certainly an asymmetry between federal law, albeit the Biden administration, you saw that announcement, was it yesterday or the day before, to reduce, and that's subject to a 30-day, I think it's 30 or 60-day hearing process or comment process. But, and DEA, I just read an article, said it's supporting that. I mean, there has been a change, obviously, in the United States and other countries in terms of how marijuana is viewed. And I would also say, harm reduction, those two words together, that is a huge change. 7 years ago, harm reduction was a bad word, bad term to say. That has changed because governments have realized that harm reduction is valuable, especially when it comes to drugs that kill people and kill people very quickly. And then especially with adulterants, where you can take a pill that you don't know has fentanyl, but it does. I mean, so harm reduction is I can't emphasize enough how much of a change views on harm reduction, or the acceptance of the embrace of harm reduction has been in the United States and in other countries.
Another question.
Hi, thanks very much for coming tonight. I have a broader question for you and then a specific. You've talked about working on, or many people have worked on drug policy for decades, particularly in Latin America. What do you see as the connection between drugs, gangs, and bigger causes of conflict and insecurity? For example, if you look at the UN Security Council, it doesn't touch these issues, even though one could argue they're threats to international peace and security by disruption of society, informal economies becoming weaponized, governance perhaps being undermined deeply by corruption. Or do you think, well, no, these are relatively manageable problems that are very challenging for populations, but do not rise to the threats of international peace and security at the kind of level of, say, a Security Council consideration? And then more specifically, if I could ask about Haiti, we read in the news about the gangs. They seem like very powerful gangs. Do you consider that a nexus as well for drug trade, or no, that's a different case altogether? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take the second one first. Haiti, absolutely. As we know from reading the press, gangs are a terrible, criminal gangs are a terrible problem in Haiti and threatening the stability of the country. And what's needed in Haiti is really baseline security, and whether that's an international force coming in, that remains to be seen. Does Haiti suffer from drug trafficking? Absolutely. There are drugs. We put out a report on drug supply a couple of years ago, and I always preface any comments on drug supply statistics by saying they're not going to be perfect statistics because the traffickers are not providing us with their data, right? So you do the best you can based on national observatories and other sources. I don't know, it is certainly not the most important country when it comes to drug trafficking. And my guess is, well, I don't know, maybe because some of the political instability, some of the drug trafficking organizations, well, I'm not sure. Are they avoiding Haiti or are they exploiting it more? Don't know. Don't have that data. But your first question, repeat it again, or just give me the. Sorry.
And I could be more pointed. Say if you even look at the organization of the U.S. State Department, it's often treated as a regional issue, drugs,
yes,
even though it's not.
Right.
And gangs are often treated as a localized problem, a corruption problem, but not rising to a threat to international peace and security. So certain tools are never used to address it. It's seen sort of as a domestic problem.
Yeah, I think it's a little of both. I think certainly the drug problem, as I said at the end, thanks for repeating it, as I said at the outset, drugs affect every country. There is a drug problem in every country in the world. And I go to Vienna once a year to this is the UN drug. So it is an important issue at the UN. Does it come up in the Security Council all the time? No, it doesn't. But there is a conference on narcotic drugs held every March in Vienna. And Secretary Blinken it was actually the first time a U.S. Secretary of State had addressed that body, but came and what was the hook? It was synthetics.
UNODC?
UNODC, yeah, to the Conference on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna. The UNODC is the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. That's the body, or that's the office in Vienna. But and it was synthetics, and the U.S. is in fact leading a global coalition on synthetic drugs, to which I think the last number was 151 countries are members, which just shows, somewhere around 200 countries in the world. 3/4 of them are members of this global coalition, meaning it's not just the US and Canada and Western Europe that's thinking about synthetic drugs, every place, because they know if it's not a problem now, it's coming, and that was exactly Secretary Blinken's message, and I agree. Is it on the same level as nuclear, this kind of thing? Maybe not. I mean, in terms of the damage that can be done very quickly. But in terms of, and you said it, undermining societies and corruption, and because there is so much money in it, and one could argue, and I would, that corruption undermines institutionality, good governments in many, many countries. So it's pernicious, and it's there. It isn't. on that level as sexy, let's say, as nuclear or biological warfare, et cetera, because it doesn't kill people immediately, but it's certainly killing a lot of people. It's a slow burn, if you will. You divide 100,000 people by 365 days, it's still a lot of people that are dying every day. So, and not to mention the corruption, not to mention trafficking, and it is a very difficult problem. Unfortunately, one that is not going away, but doesn't mean you don't try to stop it, control it where you can, and that's what we try to do. Thanks.
Well, thank you all. Oh, we have one final question.
We've talked a lot about sort of like illicit drug trade and like illegal drugs that are being produced by like gangs and stuff like that. But like, what's the role of like pharmaceutical companies and like the abuse of like legal drugs in the United States and other places? I'm thinking like the opioid crisis, from my understanding, started a lot with people getting like opioids in a legal way and then seeking out other sources. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role of like pharmaceutical companies and legal drugs. And
yeah, you're absolutely. It's a great question. You're absolutely right. And we have, and I should have said this a while ago, but I'll say it now. The OAS has a hemispheric strategy on drugs. These are documents. It's all online, of course, but a strategy on drugs and a corresponding plan of action. The current plan of action goes from 2021 to 2025. And it talks about all these things, demand reduction and supply reduction and alternatives to incarceration. Also, by the way, just parenthetically, one of the things in our strategy and plan of action is the provision of drugs for palliative care. Because although, if you have cancer or some other terrible disease and you need pain-killing drugs, you take it for granted here, you're going to get them in the hospital. Not the case in many countries around the world, including many. Morphine, it turns out, is a very inexpensive drug to produce, and so not highly underproduced because not as much money to be made. And so many countries, including Mexico just to the south, have a problem with an insufficient supply of morphine and other pain-killing drugs. Terrible to think about. But legal drugs, part of our strategy and plan of action talk about the misuse of illicit drugs, of legal drugs. And no better example than the way people got hooked on legal opioids in this country, which really, talking about just before the session, spurred the opioid problem in the U.S. And to a certain extent, there are many people who have surgery, get an opioid legitimately for legitimate use, but for whatever reason, biological, physiological, whatever it is, get hooked and then turn to, after the prescription runs out, turn to an illicit opioid. And it's a tremendous problem. And I can only point to all of the newspaper stories and television stories and lawsuits, et cetera, in this country about the legal supply of opioids. Yeah.
Well, great. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming. Great to have you. Thank you for your comments. Thank you all very much for coming. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.